Hi, my name is Anthony Giordano, and this is a presentation on FPGA-based data acquisition processing systems and their functionality. The paper as a whole that I wrote on this topic uh, just overviews the benefits of introducing a FPGA processing system into systems that require GPS navigation instead of the usual just hardware that would be built with the GPS system itself. Um, so a lot of systems nowadays take advantage of GPS technology uh, for many different avenues of research. Um, the amount of information that you can get from a simple just finding out where, when, how fast an object or test subject is moving throughout the world is highly valuable data sometimes. It all depends, obviously, on the nature of the uh, experiment, but GPS navigation systems allow for a lot of accuracy when it comes to this in this field of data. Uh, the a lot of older systems had hardware limitations that were at the end of the day came down more to cost than anything. Uh, when building these systems, they would imbue in the hardware the actual processing of these GPS systems, uh, which is fine. It was power efficient back in the day. Back in the day, 10 years ago maybe. It's power efficient and uh, operated uh, it operated well. We were able to get a plethora of data. Nowadays, with the advancements in FPGA technology, we are beginning to see more flexibility in these analysis systems because of the dropping cost of building these field programmable gate array devices. Um, so for the majority of this, I'm going to be talking about the different uses and different experiments conducted with these devices. But first, we're actually going to talk about how these devices actually work. So, with GPS systems, they're relatively easy to understand. They first send out a signal that travels up to near satellites. I believe that a lot of systems they get responses from more than one satellite, and they have to naturally decide which one they're actually gonna receive data from. Most of the time, it's the closest one to them, uh, and then the signal comes back to them, and they use the like multiple different uh, methods to be able to of positioning, Doppler effect calculations, and a lot of other nitty gritty little ways to determine one's relative positioning. And then they use that relative positioning to figure out all sorts of things. Uh, Speed, acceleration, once you have the time in between sent signal and receive signal, you can pretty much figure out uh, how fast you're going, how fast the sensor is going in relationship to its last point, how fast it accelerate. You can do that with multiple points along the line, and uh, because this is a three-dimensional system, you can figure out the altitude of the device. You could figure out on top of the latitude and longitude uh, throughout the world. The FPGA comes in where now you have this data of where you are. You have the GPS has this information of, hey, I am at latitude A, longitude B, and altitude C. Now the FPGA comes in and taking in that data and organizing it for the microprocessor to be able to do a multitude of things after the fact. It's more of a device that comes in and handles the bulk of the information coming in rather than the heavy duty processing of the here and now. The GPS still handles a lot of the actual calculations of like where you are and whatnot, but then the FPGA takes that data and then converts it to a usable format that the microprocessor can use and store in the memory later on. Come on. Okay. This obviously is a very useful system. You can now take not only the GPS signal and then push it straight to a set of hardware, but now you can take the actual information and distribute it out without actually having to go through multiple steps. Through the software implementation of the FPGA, you can send this data into a multitude of sources without having to store it first. You can also introduce other devices, other sensory devices, which I am just about to get into, to get a better picture of what is actually happening at the current time. The next part is based off of a paper by, let's see the name, Alice Prochuska, and they did an experiment where they had a cyclist travel from, I believe it was Oxford to Windsor in England, with this FPGA GPS system, combined with a heart monitor system. The big thing in this paper was whether we can reliably get both the GPS signal, from the latitude, longitude, altitude, on top of the heart monitor system at the same time, and the data that comes out is cohesive and responsive. The big challenge within this paper was not the actual receiving of the signal and implementing into the FPGA. It was the time differences in the actual receptors of the individual devices. The GPS and the heart monitor both receive data at different rates and have to have different timestamps on them. So when the GPS takes a few seconds just to actually like half a second to fully understand its positioning, the heart monitor might not. Not only do you have to take into account the differences in when the actual devices produce the data and read it, but you also have to take into account the individual clocks of the devices themselves, so you don't lose that much data in just receiving it. Because when you take data from an external sensor into the FPGA, each device has its own internal clock. And you have to have the FPGA read the data at a relative clock signal so that you don't lose the majority of the signal. A lot of the times you can't get a one-to-one because of the different rates of the clocks. So you're going to end up losing, I believe, one paper said they would lose maybe 12 points out of every 100,000. But at the end of the day, that's not a lot. You're still going to get pretty accurate data, but at the same time, there is still that possibility of losing important parts of information just down the line. This study had to not only worry about the GPS's relative internal clock to the FPGA, but also the heart monitors. So they had but due to the programmable nature of the FPGA, it was actually easier to implement these multi-clock systems because of because the systems themselves are programmable. So you can have relative clocks separate for each individual device that's coming in and still get pretty reliable data. The end of the paper, they're mostly worried about the actual responsiveness of the system. They were using the correlations between average height, average change altitude, average, and then average heart rate, which are well documented phenomenon. You slow down as you increase your altitude, well then your heart rate goes up because as on a bike you have to put more energy to move even at a slower rate as you escalate altitude, because the location in London that in England which they chose to ride was very hilly. There was one major hill in this, and they even took separate routes on the way there and the way back. So in the data, when they show latitude and longitude by altitude, you can see the actual hills in the actual data. I'll leave a link to the paper below. And they were primarily just using this as a means of like testing the responsiveness of the system, because it wasn't to figure out the relationship between like cycling speed, height, and rate of change in relationship to the heart rate, because cycling to cycling, you're actually going to expend energy, heart rate's going to go up no matter what, but it was to understand the reliability of the system. In another paper, they not only integrate, their goal was to integrate more systems to do the same thing as a GPS system, but at a higher data fidelity. In a paper by Bogardi L. Gupta S. and Konala V. Can't pronounce the names, but paper will be in the description. They are on top of the GPS. They wanted to implement a accelerometer and a gyroscope as well that connects to the FPGA system. They call the accelerometer gyroscope system an INS. I believe that stands for blah 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 blah. Not important. They call it an INS instead of just keep saying accelerometer and gyroscope system. The accelerometer was a three-dimensional accelerometer, same as a gyroscope, and they were using this combined system to fill in gaps in the GPS system's data. I wouldn't say gaps. They're trying to get a clear picture, but to do that, they actually had to filter the accelerometer gyroscope signal a lot better and in a different manner than they normally would have. And they were using this eventual signal to clean out the curves of the GPS system. Whether they're successful or not, they even themselves said that this system needs a bit more tooling. But at the figure at the end of the paper, their figures showing the correlation with their relative data and their expected real data show that the system needs a bit more tooling, but the idea is still there. In conclusion, the majority of this comes down of integration of FPGA and GPS systems comes down to whether the flexibility of a FPGA data acquisition system can be more beneficial when reading GPS signals than just the raw hardware of olden days. Olden days, God. The with the power that is required to run most FPGA systems nowadays, it actually is becoming more and more efficient to actually run with these FPGA systems, and the flexibility allows for the same sensors and to be used in multiple different experiments without having to specialize each individual piece. Because you're not spending a ton of money on specializing individual sensors, you're able to go more generic, and even though you might lose sensitivity with a more specific sensor. So at the end of the day, it comes down to cost, and it all depends on the individual needs of the research team that needs it. But this system does allow for a lot of flexibility in avenues of research. So thank you for your time. Signing out.